In this presentation, we will talk about the effect of agriculture on food waste and freshwater availability, and its effect on obesity and the global food system. First, I want to define a few words that you may be unfamiliar with. Freshwater availability is the amount of water that can be used for mainly drinking and farming. This includes freshwater lakes, ponds, streams, and groundwater that does not contain salt. Food waste is defined by the USDA as the edible amount of food post-harvest that is available for human consumption but is not consumed for any reason. Next, obesity is defined as having a weight that is higher than what is considered healthy for a given height, defined mostly by BMI. Finally, the global food system is not an organization, but a group of interrelated factors that are involved in how food gets from a farm to the consumer. Later in this presentation, we'll discuss agriculture's influence on obesity, the future of the global food system, and finally, we'll sum up the findings of the information that is presented. But first, we're going to talk more about agriculture. Agriculture is a science or practice of farming, including the cultivation of soil for the growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food and other products. According to the Census of Agriculture, in 2010, there were over 2 million farms in the United States that were producing food, animal feed, and livestock. The challenge we are faced with agriculture is a growing number of people globally. We have to not only find ways to continue to produce crops at an increased rate, but also make sure that future generations are able to sustain themselves. With the agricultural practices that are widely used today, in regards to water consumption, there is a real danger of not having enough fresh water to support agriculture. On top of the consumption of water, current agricultural practices are causing pollution to the fresh, ground, and surface water. When looking at this infographic, you can see that the world population has been steadily growing since 1927, where there were about 2 billion people on Earth. This graphic also shows that the population of our Earth in 2011 was around 7 billion people. With the advances of medicine and the fact that people are living longer, it is estimated that by 2050, there will be about 9 billion people on Earth. With there being that many people on Earth, production globally of food must increase by 70% by 2050 to meet our global food consumption need. In regards to land, our current rate of agricultural production will need 6 times more land worldwide to accommodate for the amount of water that agriculture uses currently. If we need to have 70% more production, that 6% could increase exponentially if we do not find more sustainable ways to farm and raise livestock. When talking about freshwater availability as a whole, only 3.5% of the Earth is freshwater, which was defined earlier in the presentation. More than half of this 3.5%, 68% to be exact, is contained in ice caps and glaciers. That leaves the other 32% available for use. Out of the remaining 32%, the United States alone uses 355 billion gallons of water per day. 117 billion goes to agriculture alone. That is almost 1/3 of the freshwater consumption in the United States per day. Fresh water is an extraordinarily important resource because of its lack of salt. It can be used for various purposes, especially agriculture, although the use of fresh water in agriculture has its downfalls. Agricultural practices these days include the use of a multitude of pesticides and fertilizers to increase crop production. Although these pesticides and fertilizers do produce results, they have many negative effects on the environment, one of which is runoff. Runoff is the water that does not soak into the soil to nourish the crops, but rolls off the soil and into nearby water supplies. This can be detrimental to the environment because runoff contains the pesticides and fertilizers that are sprayed onto the crops. One of the more recent problems that, coupled with climate change, has resulted from farming runoff is algal blooms, where an overgrowth of algae occurs and has the potential to produce toxins that can be detrimental to the health of humans and animals. In 2011, Toledo, Ohio experienced one of the worst algal blooms in recent history. This bloom affected over 500,000 Toledo residents. They were not able to use their tap water because the water they used from Lake Erie was contaminated with toxins from the algal bloom that could cause neurological impairment if consumed. When talking about food waste, up to 1/3 of all food that is produced globally is squandered or spoiled before it has a chance to be consumed. This amount of waste is equal to 4 billion tons of food and almost $1 trillion in losses. These losses not only account for food, but also the wasted energy, land, and labor that went into producing that food. The loss of this food can happen when storing, transporting, or even when the food arrives at its destination and does not meet the aesthetic standards of the grocery store. The loss of food in early stages of production, specifically storing and transporting, also translates to not only lower income for small farmers around the world, but also increased prices for customers. In the industrial agriculture system, there is an emphasis of cash crops such as corn, wheat, and soy, where a crop is grown for its ability to generate revenue rather than its ability to be used. This contributes to food waste because cash crops are produced in such bulk that the loss of some crop in transportation or storage has little effect on the revenue, making it less of a focus for the farmers. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, if only 1/4 of the food that is lost or wasted globally per year could be saved, it would be enough to feed 870 million hungry people throughout the world. Obesity has become an increasing problem around the world. With the increased availability of convenience foods, this can be related to the food system that is comprised of many interrelated factors involving growing, harvesting, transporting, and the processing of food from the farm to the consumer. These factors include, but are not limited to, social, political, economic, and environmental influences. Agriculture and its effects on the food system have played a considerable role in obesity becoming an epidemic around the world. Transporting food long distances, the consolidation of farming and the food industry, and the increasing production of cash crops are all factors that have changed in the last 50 years. The amount of energy in food and the availability of these energy-dense, highly processed, inexpensive, widely available foods, coupled with changing agricultural practices, is likely responsible for the rising levels of obesity. The combination of these two changes to the food system make it much more difficult for people of lower socioeconomic status to access fresh fruits and vegetables, which, if we're talking about food waste, are the most wasted food around the world. There is a growing recognition that food insecurity also exists among the same group of lower-end socioeconomic people. The inequitable availability of health foods to people with less income contribute to obesity because there are disparities between the prices of healthier foods, fresh fruits and vegetables, and highly processed, less nutritious convenience foods. These healthier foods can cost considerably more than the convenience foods, making them difficult for people who have less income to purchase. The effect of agriculture on obesity can be linked to many factors, but food waste is one that needs to have more recognition because the amount of food wasted worldwide not only causes prices of fresh and healthy food to be inflated, but causes there to be less total food available for people around the world. In turn, this allows less healthy convenience foods to be the easier choice for people of lower socioeconomic status and higher food insecurity to persist, which is a contributing factor to the prevalence of obesity around the world. The infographic on this slide shows from 1980 there were 250 million people in the United States that were overweight or obese, and that has inflated to over 900 million people in 2008 that are considered overweight or obese. Moving forward to the future of the global food system, there are many things to be considered. The influence of agriculture on how much food is wasted around the world and its damaging effects on fresh water, the ability to produce adequate amounts of food and its availability to all people are fundamental factors to this global food system. Although food is currently cheaper and more readily available than almost any other time in history, 1 in 7 people around the world do not have access to sufficient food. The need for an increase of food production, coupled with the competition for farmland, water, and other natural resources, threaten the world's ability to provide a sufficient amount of food to feed its constantly increasing population. With the Earth predicted to reach a population of around 9 billion by 2050, the question of being able to feed a growing world population healthily and sustainably is one that troubles many researchers, scientists, and world leaders equally. Although crop yields around the world have increased over the past 50 years, there is a concern that we have reached the ceiling of crop production. That is not the case. There are many developing countries that do not have the industrialized practices that are in countries like China or the United States. These countries can develop these high-yield industrial practices and increase total global food production. Some questions that arise include that if developing countries have the infrastructure and resources to adopt an industrial agriculture, is it ethical to adopt these practices because of the negative environmental implications that we know of that accompany this way of food production? In the same vein, can countries that already have these industrial practices continue these practices, not only ethically, if they are aware that they are a major contributor to freshwater pollution, but practically, when the current techniques consume extraordinary amounts of the limited freshwater supply? The future of agriculture around the world, whether it is a better, more efficient system to produce food while reducing waste and freshwater pollution, or current practices are continued, freshwater and other resources are depleted, and food continues to be wasted, will have a direct impact on the availability of food, its influence on obesity rates in the growing world population, and will have lasting implications on the global food system. To conclude what we've talked about today, we're talking about how agriculture is one of the most important practices in the world, if not the most important. There are many factors that influence agriculture: location, climate, regulations in that area, just to name a few. Agriculture is an invaluable practice that provides nourishment and income to billions of people worldwide. It also has numerous negative implications on the world, including its role in food waste and freshwater availability, which in turn influence obesity and the global food system. There have been many strides in reducing food waste that have been taken by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and also United States Department of Agriculture, but there is still a long way to go until food waste is markedly reduced around the world. When looking at the global availability of fresh water, it is hypothesized that to sustain our current agricultural practices, there would have to be over 6 times as much cropland globally for it to be sustainable. The advances in science and decisions made worldwide in the next few decades will determine whether every person on Earth will have access to adequate food, and in the near future, I believe there needs to be a comprehensive examination of the global agricultural policy and its implications on food security in people of lower socioeconomic status, the wasting of food, and availability of water, and then examining those influences on the factors of obesity and the worldwide food system.